Our speaker this morning is Cepull. Megan was born and raised in Central Florida, and she had an idyllic childhood, except for having been misdiagnosed as a boy at birth. While always aware that she was different, she was in her 40s before she discovered precisely what it was and began to live authentically. Since coming out as a transgender lesbian woman, she rediscovered her passion for writing. And thanks to the thriving LGBTQ community here in Central Florida and beyond, began learning about advocacy and activism. Megan is a lifelong learner and Christian and sees the two as tightly connected, attending First United Methodist Church of Orlando for her entire childhood and much of her adult life. She is currently working within FUMCO to move towards full inclusion and affirmation of all marginalized communities within the church. She works in information technology and has a passion, although not necessarily a talent. I'm sure that's wrong, for the performing arts. So would you please welcome Megan.
Good morning. So the working title for what I was going to present today was When I Was a Little Girl. And looking at me now, it's kind of hard to believe, isn't it, that I was ever little? Or was it that I was a girl? I mean, for a large portion of my life, I didn't believe it myself. My disbelief was so strong that I still have to fight to use the phrase, when I was a little girl. And when I describe my childhood, I use phrases like when I was a kid or when I was growing up. It's easier that way to avoid the discomfort. But I've come to realize I was a little girl with a rather unfortunate congenital condition. So as he said, I'm transgender. More specifically, I'm a demisexual transgender lesbian woman. I'm going for as many of the letters from LGBTQ plus as I can. So, demisexual. I have to have a strong emotional connection with someone before I experience any kind of attraction to them. Lesbian. Oh, and for the record, that's only happened once in my life, and I married that woman.
Good for you.
Lesbian, I'm a woman who is oriented to experience attraction to other women. Being demisexual, how can I really know? Well, to be honest, I don't. But when I form strong emotional bonds, I've only ever done so with other women, so the likelihood that I would find myself attracted to men seems rather small. Transgender, this is the one that a lot of people get hung up on. What does it mean to be transgender? Why would anyone be transgender? Well, I've got a few answers. Because I like playing life on hard mode. Because I was bitten by a radioactive woman. Because one puberty wasn't enough, so I went back for seconds. I signed up for the free trial and I forgot to cancel. I don't like paying for my own drinks. And because I was a bad boy. More seriously, being transgender just means that the gender that I experience is incongruent with the gender that I was assigned when I was born. When I was born, the doctor took a look between my legs and proclaimed, "It's a boy," and that's when I began crying. When a medical professional says something like, "It's a boy," they're making a statement about the baby's sex, whether the baby is male or female, and more specifically about the appearance of certain external body parts. The rest of society takes that statement and adds a layer of expectations. What will this baby be like? Will they want to play with dolls or with trucks? Will they like pink or will they like blue? Will they become a doctor, scientist, or a nurse or a teacher? Thankfully, we as a society are unlearning some of these behaviors, but we largely still place expectations upon our children on the basis of whether they're a boy or a girl. When we were growing up, how often did we hear phrases like, "That's not ladylike," or "Boys will be boys"? So what did I like to play with when I was young? Friends. When I was about 3 years old, I was playing in the church nursery, and I was playing with a girl, and we were having a great time. We were sliding down the slides. We were using the jack-in-the-box and turning the little crank, and every time it would go, pop goes the weasel, we would just laugh. It was just so funny. And all of a sudden, she looks at me, and she goes, "I can't play with you anymore because you're a boy and I'm a girl, and girls and boys don't play together." And I was 3 years old. I didn't understand why she would think that. I protested, "No, I'm a girl." And she's like, "No, you're not." And she moved to leave and go away. And I was just really upset. And one of the adults came over to try to find out what had happened. So she pulls me into her arms and she gives me a hug and she tells me, "Well, what's going on?" And I said, "Well, she said that I'm a boy, but I'm not. I'm a girl." And this adult, meaning well, told me, "Oh, don't be silly. Of course you're a boy." And I remember thinking at that time, but how do you know? Nobody asked me. So that's a common question that's asked of trans people is, when did you know? It's a tricky question because it's often searching for some kind of a common narrative for what all trans people experience. And as with all of you, our experiences are all different. So we figure things out about ourselves at different times in our lives. And for me, I knew at 3 years old. I had no idea about body parts or chromosomes or hormones, but I still knew I was a girl. The problem was that I was 3 years old. At that age, the one thing you know for certain is that grown-ups know everything. So when that kind woman told me that I was being silly and that I was a boy, I wondered how I had gotten it so wrong. I had no way to prove that I was a girl. I was in boys' clothes. I had short hair, and everyone told me that I was a boy. What proof was I supposed to rely on? It was on that day that I got my first lesson that when people think you're a boy, telling them that you're a girl is not safe. That was the first day that I stepped into the closet. At these young ages, I had no idea about the biological concepts of male and female. I just knew that when the teachers told the class to line up with one line for boys and another line for girls, that I belonged in the line for girls. And I also knew that if I dared to stand in that line, that I would be laughed at. I had no idea about the social constructs of masculinity and femininity, just that if I ever tried to play with the girls at recess, I risked being laughed at all over again. I learned that in order to survive, I needed to learn how to be the best boy I could be. But I didn't have a manual, the one titled How to Be a Boy. Apparently my copy had been lost in the mail. But I was a good student and I studied. I watched the ways that the boys behaved and tried to mimic their behaviors. When waiting in the lunch line and the topic turned to, which are better, boys or girls, I parroted the things that I heard the boys saying, all the while secretly knowing that the girls were right. Girls are better than boys. I figured that families come with mommies and daddies, and so for humans to continue to exist, half of the people had to be boys and half of the people got to be girls. I figured that the boys were just unlucky, and so they put up a good front to hide their disappointment. Imagine my shock and surprise when I found out that most boys were happy and actually liked that arrangement. In order to survive, I had to get good at hiding parts of myself. I learned that the worst thing a boy could be was a girl, so I worked to make sure that there were no parts of me which could be perceived as girl. It wasn't just a matter of not engaging in stereotypically feminine behavior. I had to actively reject them. When in the church children's choir, the director, Suzanne, who I'm still good friends with to this day, she selected me to play the finger cymbals for one of our songs. For whatever reason, my young mind associated the finger cymbals with belly dancing, and I had only ever seen examples of belly dancing done by women. I was afraid that by even touching those finger cymbals, my secret would be revealed and my world would come crashing down. So instead, I had a panic attack, which took another adult a solid 10 minutes to get me to calm down from. And recently, I had a conversation with Suzanne, and I told her what happened. She'd had no idea that was what was going on. And when she tried to apologize to me, I told her she had done nothing wrong. This was a product of years of learning how to survive while flying under the radar. When puberty hit, it hit me hard. Puberty is no fun for anybody, but for me, I was experiencing the terror of watching my body not only change, but change in completely wrong ways. While the boys were discussing leg hair and other hair in the junior high locker room, I was secretly pleased that mine had not begun growing yet. When they began talking about other girls' bodies, I listened in horror at their descriptions. They were objectifying and demeaning, and yet I was too scared to speak up and tell them to stop, or else I'd be branded a sissy or gay or words that mean that but are much worse to use. Occasionally, a boy would sneak a magazine to the locker room and the rest would crowd around to look. I had my own secret stash of magazines, but mine were magazines like 17. They were my guilty pleasure. Specifically the prom issue. I love the prom issues. I would slowly page through those issues, picking out my favorite dresses and the ones which I wanted to wear to my prom, knowing fully well that that was an impossibility. I never went to any of my proms or homecomings. I couldn't bear having to dress up in a suit while watching all the girls wearing pretty dresses with their hair and makeup done perfectly. I became really good at denial and suppression as coping mechanisms, but they were by no means perfect. Any time that a trace of femininity came up inside of me, I would crush it back down and bury it as deep as I could, and I would feel a mixture of guilt, shame, and disgust in myself. And yet they still came. All throughout my life, it was a pattern. Something would come up. I might even indulge in it for a moment. And then the guilt, shame, and disgust would come crashing down and I'd feel even worse. I felt broken. I felt defective. When it came to church, I was relatively lucky. I was born and raised in the Methodist Church, specifically the First United Methodist Church of Orlando, the big white one downtown. I attended Sunday school without fail and quickly distinguished myself with my ability to quickly locate a specific book, chapter, and verse in the Bible faster than my peers. I learned the stories and heard the messages within. Jesus loves me, this I know, for the Bible tells me so. I learned to pray and was told that if I prayed, God would answer my prayers. So as a child, I would say, now I lay me down to sleep every night and silently add one more request. Please, God, let me wake up tomorrow as a girl. Each morning I'd wake up disappointed and I went about my daily routine. I began to believe that God didn't care enough about me to answer this one prayer. Maybe it was because I was so broken and defective. By my teens, I'd accepted that God wasn't going to answer my prayers to become a girl. And so I changed the ask, something simpler, something easier. Please, God, take away these feelings. But they never went away. Again, I believed it must be because God didn't care enough about me to answer this new prayer, this easier prayer. Maybe it was because I was so broken and defective. I knew that I believed in God, but I wasn't so sure if God believed in me. But as I said earlier, I was pretty lucky when it came to church. Growing up, I was surrounded by adults who genuinely cared for my well-being And even though they might have messed a few things up, they really were trying to act in my best interests, at least what they understood to be my best interests at that time. When I entered youth group, we had an amazing youth director named Vicky, and I'm still in contact with her today. And I've since discovered that Vicky was in her young 20s, and she was in way over her head. She and a group of parent volunteers led that youth group through some amazing experiences. We had Sunday night Methodist Youth Fellowship. We had afterglows to local fun spots. We had choir tours, mission trips, summer camps, and a variety of retreats. As would be expected with a group of 7th to 12th graders, we were a handful, and we often got into trouble. But every time, Vicki met us with a message of, I'm disappointed in what happened, but know that I still love you and always will. Now let's figure out how to make this better. She and those adults worked hard, and we made them work very, very hard to show us unconditional love. And it worked. We still get together once or twice a year to catch up and reminisce. Most of us from the youth group are still in touch to this day. And for whatever reason, there are a number of us, much more than would be expected, who ended up being LGBTQ+. We needed a place where we could learn that we were lovable and, indeed, are loved, regardless of what is wrong with us. And that isn't to say that being LGBTQ+ is wrong. Not at all. In those days, that was the message that most religious sources gave, though. And again, we were fairly lucky because the First United Methodist Church of Orlando largely ignored these topics. A few of us who are LGBTQ+ have discussed this recently, and we agreed that in hindsight, this was about the best thing that could have happened. The prevailing attitudes of those times, if there had been anything said, it would have been very negative. So as it was, hearing nothing at all was less harmful. I remained at the First United Methodist Church until my late 20s when my wife and I moved to Colorado. Out west, we tried out a number of churches, mostly non-denominational, and we never found a fit. For me, I quickly developed my own litmus test. How did a given church treat gay people? In those days, I still had no idea that I was gay. I was in deep, deep denial about being trans, but I knew that I was unlikely to be able to be in community with people for whom being gay was an abomination. None of those non-denominational churches passed my test, and we didn't attend any of them for more than about a year or so. We finally settled in with another Methodist church, the Littleton United Methodist Church. And at the time, that was led by 2 women pastors. And again, nothing was said about LGBTQ+ people in that church, but by then I was growing a little bit bolder in my activism. And at that time, I saw that as allyship. At congregational steering meetings, I proposed a stronger stance and statements welcoming and including LGBTQ+ people into the church. It felt like such a risk at that time. And while my suggestions were received favorably, the congregation decided to focus on other areas first. Okay, fair enough. At least that wasn't a no. We stayed at that church for many years until we moved back to Orlando. About a year after we moved back, my father succumbed to cancer and passed away. And while going through his papers, I came across a statement of faith which he had written as part of a Sunday school exercise a few years prior. And reading through it, a few lines stood out to me. And I think that they'll probably speak to you as well because they seem to align with the core values of your church. I honor and respect your beliefs and the way you believe. Please do the same for me. If my faith does not change with time, I'm not using my God-given intelligence. I may be spiritually dead. God gave us a brain to use. None of us know all the answers. Any questions are valid, as are any answers, including, I don't know, or I don't want to go there, or see me offline. I think there is a supreme power in the universe. God, spirit, energy, wisdom, power. God or Heavenly Father are the terms I most often use, even though I think arguments as to whether God is male or female tend to trivialize God and show our inability to really understand that spirit we call God. Some things we bring upon ourselves, others just happen for reasons we may or may not understand. Although I don't do it very often or very well, I know that prayers are sometimes answered. I also think that C.S. Lewis had it right when he said that prayer does not change God, it changes the one who prays. Wow. I ended up reading the entire statement at his celebration of life service, and I believe that set in motion what came over the next 2 months for me. I'd been having insomnia more and more, and during those sleepless nights, thoughts of my own mortality, my life's direction, and of my gender were muddled and mixed up. Each night, I'd deal with these thoughts and make resolutions to do things in the morning, and then I'd finally fall asleep. Each morning when I woke up, I'd think about the night before and think, well, that was silly. What was I thinking? It culminated in one night where I could not take the internal chaos, so I began writing these thoughts down, and it worked. Each thought that I wrote would then become silent, and I was able to slowly bring my thoughts back under control and into some sense of order. And a few thoughts stuck with me, and these are these thoughts. For quite a while, I've had a sensation that my male body does not match what my brain expects to see and feel. I look in the mirror and I recognize myself, my face, my body parts, etc. But I feel something is off. This sensation can change in intensity. Sometimes it almost disappears, but it never quite completely disappears. Sometimes this sensation is so strong that it's overwhelming. At these times, my body feels too big, too masculine, almost like I'm wearing one of those inflatable sumo wrestler suits. I feel despair from a sense that no matter what I do, I may never feel at home in my own body. Interestingly, I've noticed that I've mostly stopped looking in mirrors. I will look in a mirror when I need to brush my hair, check my face, make sure I've cleaned it properly, to shave, and occasionally to check my clothes to make sure they look decent before going out. An exception to this is when I'm in feminine clothes. Then I'm more willing and able to look in the mirror. I need to stop hurting. I need to stop the pain I feel, and I need to stop causing pain to my wife. I do not believe that I would or could ever take such drastic actions, but I have had thoughts that perhaps it would be easier for everyone if I simply didn't exist. And then I had the thought, which finally broke through for me. If I don't do something, they're going to bury me in a suit. I cannot spend eternity in a suit. I need to be buried in a dress. I don't know why that was the thought that broke the dam for me, but it did. Soon after writing this, I finally fell asleep, utterly exhausted. But when I woke up later that day, I returned to what I had written, and my response was, oh crap, it's all still true. That was the day I finally came out to myself, and later that day to my wife. That was the day I began my transition, which I only realized that later. I've had an amazing transition. I've had access to all the therapy, support, information, medical interventions that I've needed, and I'm in a much better place. I look in the mirror these days, and I'm happy with what I see. I see a woman fully realized and finally living her own life and not someone else's. Transition did not make me happy, but it removed significant barriers to my happiness. I never knew what happiness felt like until I began transition. Prior to that, I'd only ever known degrees of misery, and I'd concluded that happiness must be when I felt the least miserable. Another unexpected discovery from transition is when I finally came out to the world. I was mostly met with positivity and congratulations. Those youth and parents from the youth group showed up too. One friend met me with, well, I don't understand it, and I don't know if I agree with what you're going through, but I do know that I love you, and you will always be my friend. When we met face-to-face a year or so later, she greeted me with open arms and with happiness. The lessons from that youth group manifested. We were shown how to love unconditionally and we carry that into our relationships within the group and outside of the group. So, let's address one of the common misunderstandings about transition. I did not transition to become a woman. I transitioned to live as who I've always been, but had to keep hidden. I've always been a woman. I was a woman in that nursery when I first protested that I was a girl. I was a woman when I went swimming shirtless and in boys' trunks. I was a woman when my voice deepened and hair began growing in unwelcome places. I was a woman when I had my first kiss. I was a woman when I married my wife. I was a woman when we welcomed our first child home. I was a woman when I fed, changed, read to, and rocked that child to sleep, and all the time she threw up on me, had a diaper blowout, got a fever, got immunized. And I cried when she got immunized. Her getting that shot. And when she was hospitalized at 2 years old from dehydration, I crawled into that bed with her and I held her the entire night so that she knew she was not alone. I was a woman when I got my first job, when I got my first car, and when we bought our first house. It doesn't matter what I look like. It doesn't even matter what I believed at the time. Sometimes we learn things which change how we perceive the past. Humans used to believe that the sun orbited the earth, but does that mean that when Copernicus discovered the truth that the earth suddenly slammed into orbit around the sun? Of course not. The earth had always revolved around the sun, even when we didn't know it. So regardless of what I or anyone else believed back then, I was a woman. And that means that when I was a child, I was a girl. So, when I was a little girl, sure, I had lots of times when things weren't so great, when I was bullied, when I was scared that a secret that I had held and protected so closely might be discovered, and I would literally just die. But when I was a little girl, I got to see the other side of the coin. I got to see all the good things and all the bad things we do to each other on the basis of our genders. And I've tried to take the best of each world to carry with me for the rest of my life. When I was a little girl, I had a very confusing childhood, but I had some really unique and great experiences throughout that childhood. And as tempting as it is to say that I would rather have been born with a body which matches my gender, I can't. I am who I am today because I went through all those things, and I like who I am today. So I feel sadness for what that girl went through, for all the confusion, the heartache, guilt, shame, and despair that she felt, and I wish I could take much of that away from her, but I can't. So I honor her today by recognizing her for who she was, and so I tell people about when I was a little girl. I'm happy to take questions as long as we agree that my answers might sometimes be, as my father said, I don't know. I'm not comfortable answering that. Or see me offline. I'm largely an open book.
Does anybody have? Okay.
Thank you.
Hello.
Hi.
Who are some of your trans role models?
Ooh, that's a tricky one. I will say that, for better or for worse, Caitlyn Jenner, she came out before I did, and she was an example that it was possible to come out and still exist. Yeah. That said, I don't agree with her on much of anything besides the fact that she's a woman. So, but nowadays I look to people like Laverne Cox, Jamie Clayton. Wow, I mean, there's so many to choose from. Janet Mock is another amazing trans woman. Sarah, huh? Yeah, Sarah McBride is another one that I just love. Danica Rome. I mean, there's a large number of people to choose from on that front. And I think we're very lucky to have so many prominent trans people who are out and proud and showing the world how we can exist. Yeah.
Megan, thanks for joining us today. It was a
Of course.
beautiful story. And I just want to recognize the letter that your dad left you. That was very beautiful.
Yeah. Yeah.
Did you have a question here?
Yes, I do.
Roberta, you're next. Okay,
Thank you.
Of course.
This is really timely. I have a dear, beloved cousin who suddenly, this Facebook picture became a woman's face. And I've been very happy to see how much support my family has given him. Even people who, shockingly, are usually not supportive.
Right.
I would love for him to hear your story. Is there any way you can share your lecture today?
Actually, since I heard that it was not being recorded, I turned my phone on and I've got an audio recording.
Awesome.
Yes.
You asked if we had any questions, and I'm going to flip it around. You
Sure.
certainly answered a lot of mine. Thank
Okay.
you so much for being so, your presentation was so wonderful.
Thank you. Yes.
Any
Thank
other
you.
questions?
Hello.
Hi.
I just wanted to say thank you for sharing your story.
Of course.
As a young transgender person, it's kind of scary to think about getting older because you don't see very many trans people that make it and get through all of it. So,
Yeah.
thank you.
Thank you. And I'll just add to that when I was younger, in my 20s and 30s, I did not think about what it would be like beyond my 40s. I did not figure that I would exist for that long. So, yeah.
Harvey?
I might have missed something, but how does you and your wife get along?
It is. I will say that it is challenging. My wife is very much a straight woman, and I'm very much not. That said, we've worked on it really hard. We've had a lot of therapy. It's not easy, but we are doing the best we can. Yeah. Yeah, absolutely.
What advice do you have for talking to parents whose children might be trans and they're very unfamiliar with it?
Okay. This is a big one. First, it's on you to educate yourself. As the parent, you are the one that needs to learn about what your child is going through. You do not need to make your child educate you about what's going on. Yeah. Exactly. Trust them. Trust that what they're telling you is true. Even if it changes, trust that what they are telling you is true in that moment. And as far as concerns about changes that might take place that are irreversible, the system is largely set up to prevent those kinds of changes from occurring until after that child, that youth, has established for a long time that this is the truth, this is not going away, this will always be the case. And in fact, the statistics bear that out. The rate of detransition is about 1%, with about 0.3% of those being that the person figured out that they weren't actually the gender that they had originally thought that they were. Which, when you think about a medical procedure or any kind of a medical process, a 99% success rate is a smashing success. And they're still working to make it better. The new standards of care just came out. The standards of care version 8 just came out very recently, and they're making improvements constantly to try to improve that standard of care. to make sure that they get it right for those that need it and that they're not giving it to the people who don't. Yep.
Thank you. We have time for one more question? Well, two more questions.
Sure.
Thank you so much for sharing this.
Of course.
I have a grandson who is transgender,
Okay.
and he was also afraid to say anything to anyone. But he figured, nowadays you got the internet to do all this research on. So when he had these feelings, which he said started with puberty, he did internet research and found out all about it and got some counseling at Planned Parenthood.
Mm-hmm.
And when he was 18 and away at college, he was able to then announce it to the family. And he chose a college that had a strong LGBTQ support group.
Good.
And he's fine now. But when he was a teenager and keeping it quiet, we didn't know why he kept breaking out in rashes and stomach trouble and all that sort of thing.
Yeah.
So it affects people physically. But on October 28th, he's marrying his fiancée, and pretty happy for him.
Nice.
This will be our last question, Megan. Thank you.
Of course.
Megan, thank you so much. I really appreciate it. As an activist, ally, and writer myself, I've been posting a lot with my big mouth on Facebook. People may not be aware that there's 154 schools. A report came out in the Sentinel that discriminate against LGBTQ community, and they still take state funds, but even if they don't take state funds. They're giving hateful messages to children who are going through difficult times. So I'm really focusing on contacting schools, the Masters Academy, no offense to their curriculum, but their policies are hateful. There's many of them. And they're by degrees of hate, particularly one that came out of Tampa, where they put homosexuality in the same line as bestiality. So what the schools are doing to children, to me, is legalize brutality and hate. So I'm contacting the school and they're not answering back. I'm tagging them respectfully. I'm starting the conversation respectfully. I posted their policy. Is this correct? I'm posting it on Facebook. I'm tagging them. I'm gonna go to other schools and do it, but they're ignoring it. Which tells me if you're so tied to your biblical beliefs, why aren't you supporting them? So this is more of a statement than anything else, that if you are aware of this and there's anything we can do with the legal community, I don't know how it's legal. DeSantis allowed state vouchers to go to these schools because it was discriminatory to not allow religious schools to get scholarship funding. The backlash is, well, Laura, then you're denying kids scholarships. Well, they're hateful and they're harming kids. And they're also harming staff and administration who haven't come out. So I just want people to know that there's a lot of religious schools out there that are harming people, and whatever we can do, if I were a lawyer, I don't know what to do.
Vote.
Yeah.
Well, always vote, but
Yes.
it's more than that.
And the charity that you're supporting with your offering this month, the ACLU, is quite active in the state in fighting back against these kinds of policies. So you've selected an amazing charity.
Thank you. I just want to say, Megan, thank you so much for being here today. Megan is my neighbor, by the way. I've known her for a long time. And I just really, your message was beautiful.
Thank you.
It was so beautiful.
Thank you.
As I shared with Megan before the service started, her story is very touching for me. When I first came over here from England, I met Dave when I was 15, and Anne-Marie is still my best friend. And she's still married to the same woman that she has been married to for 50-odd years now. And the 3 children, 3 boys, went through the transition very well with that. I was very fortunate to at least redo their wedding vows on their 25th wedding anniversary. So, so Megan's story was beautiful. And thank you for sharing so deeply your story. It's a story that we need to hear, and more people need to hear it too. So,